Story 1. I was helping a friend deliver some flowers for a wedding. She asked to borrow my van and I offered to drive because the quantity was too much for her little caddy. When we arrived, I backed the van up to the door to make unloading easier. She got out first and opened the back door. A young woman came out of the building with a big smile, saying, "Thank you for this," and made the usual chit-chat, explaining that she was actually the bride. At that moment, an older gentleman came out and said, "Do you need a hand, my love?" My friend replied, "Oh, you must be the father of the bride." There was a long pause. Then the bride cleared her throat and said, "Not quite. This is my fiancé." That led to about 20 minutes of complete silence. Story 2. On the first day of college, a teacher became annoyed with a student and said, "Hey, wake up, you, the boy with the long hair, wake up." He kept insisting, and everyone in the room suddenly realized the student was actually a blind woman with her eyes closed. The teacher realized his mistake at the same moment and said, "Oh, I have made a grave mistake." Story 3. My father called my 8th grade teacher a hoochie mama during the parent-teacher interview because he heard it on television and thought it was a compliment. Story 4. There was an awkward kid on the edge of our college theater majors group who sometimes came to hang out at my apartment. One night, the guys were discussing the movie Apocalypto and someone mentioned the Mayans. The kid chimed in with a condescending, arrogant laugh and said, "It was the Aztecs, my guy. Easy mistake to make, though." The person he corrected replied calmly, "I'm pretty sure it was the Mayans in the movie." And the kid lost his temper. He stood up, aggressively approached the other guy, and screamed, "It was the Aztecs. I know what I'm talking about." Everyone went silent and felt uncomfortable. A woman said, "I just looked it up online and it was the Mayans." The aggressive guy turned bright red, muttered under his breath, and didn't speak to anyone the rest of the night. It was so uncomfortable that I still cringe when I think about it. Story 5. On a date when the guy decided it would be romantic to sing to me loudly in the middle of a busy mid-tier chain restaurant. Story 6. I went to a comedy open microphone. One woman crashed and burned so badly. We made brief eye contact and I wanted to crawl under the table on her behalf. Story 7. The head of the surgical department sent an email to the entire hospital with the subject "to fall out on roller coaster." The message contained an animated graphics interchange format image of a girl's breasts briefly exposed on a roller coaster. He remained employed. Story 8. I was the only person to show up at a coworker's surprise birthday party. He was known for burning bridges and relationships, but I thought I was doing the right thing by representing the office. I even had a card I signed as from the office. I stood in the middle of the kitchen talking to him and his wife while the entire house was decorated for the birthday. It was the longest hour of my life. Story 9. A friend of mine in college soiled himself during class. It was not a large class and everyone noticed and could smell it. He had food poisoning and it became quite a scene. Story 10. A bunch of us were taking a group photo at school. Typical, look how much fun we all have yearbook photos for school publications. One guy figured that was his chance to grab and aggressively French kiss the girl next to him who was dating another boy. Nobody knew what was happening until she shouted, "What the fuck?" She was half laughing and half crying as her friends tried to console her. Everyone else froze. The guy stood up, realizing how badly he had messed up, muttered, "I have to go," and walked out as everyone glared at him. I still cringe when I think about it. I had nothing to do with it. Story 11. Watching my divorced, jobless sister's life coaching videos on Instagram. Story 12. A colleague of mine resigned. He is a fairly attractive man. A woman from Human Resources came by his cubicle to wish him well for the future, I guess. She then gave him a lap dance in front of the whole office. Story 13. Jacob Collier asked a music college attendee if he had heard about the Circle of Fifths. Story 14. My parents are hooked on the show Ink Master and now think they are tattoo experts. Every time I am out with them, they stop the waiter, bartender, or a random stranger to ask about their tattoos. They say they watch Ink Master and are fascinated by tattoos, but in reality they want to see them up close so they can judge them after the person walks away. It is embarrassing every time. Story 15. Years ago, a group of us went to see a friend do stand-up comedy. We fake laughed the whole time because nobody else in the room was laughing. The jokes were not funny, and I felt the worst secondhand embarrassment of my life. I decided then that I would never see another friend do stand-up unless I was completely sure they would be funny. The comedian who came on after him, though, was excellent. Story 16. At university, I was relaxing in the student lounge. We were all chatting and taking random BuzzFeed quizzes. One girl reached the result of her "What's your worst personality trait" quiz, which said she was shallow. She said, "What? I'm not shallow." A graduate student, about 5 years older and not part of the conversation, replied, "Yes, you are. Otherwise you would go out with me." That was followed by the longest, most awkward silence I have ever heard. Story 17. I listened as my boss told our software supplier that the program he had developed and maintained for 30 years was a Mickey Mouse program in front of everyone. The shock on the attendees' faces and the silence that followed made me want to crawl under my desk. I did not agree with my boss. His lack of understanding of the system, not the system's capabilities, was the issue. The next day, I contacted the developer and apologized on behalf of the company, explained that I disagreed with my boss, and repaired the relationship. After that, the software supplier chose to work only with me. Story 18. This is odd, but I get extreme secondhand embarrassment when I see others get in trouble. As a child, if I saw someone yell at or talk down to my mother, I would feel embarrassed and a deep shame on her behalf. I feel similarly now. I am curious if anyone else relates. I have often wondered about this. Story 19. The ukulele apology heard around the world. Colleen Ballinger, also known as Miranda Sings. Toxic gossip train. Story 20. Possibly it was my mother yelling at a young apprentice at the hearing aid place because he could not get her a new hearing aid on a Saturday, and she would have to wait to see the consultant on Monday. To play devil's advocate, it had been 2 weeks since it stopped working. She had been trying to get in touch with the consultant since the day it died, and she was at the end of her rope. I had a moment alone with the poor man, and he seemed to understand, but I wanted to be swallowed whole while she was popping off at him. It is funny because she usually brings me along to be the aggressor for her since she is so meek, but 2 weeks without being able to hear made her snap. Story 21. My parents and I went to our favorite pizza place and there was a new waitress. I cannot recall her name. It was probably Russian or another Eastern European name. She had a strong accent. My parents noticed the accent and told her they heard it and wanted to call her Olga. I have never wanted to spontaneously combust more than in that moment. I tried to make eye contact with the waitress to apologize non-verbally. She took it in stride, since she clearly did not want to upset paying customers. She said I could call her Olga if I liked, and they did. From then on they disregarded her actual name and, whether at the restaurant or referring to her elsewhere, they kept calling her Olga. I honestly hate my parents sometimes, and it is almost always when they are out in public, especially around people who are not white, middle-class, native-born Americans. They behave like children at the zoo. Story 22. It was probably a video from Reddit. A group of high school students decided to disrupt a classroom by doing the Harlem Shake. They walked to the front of the room and started dancing. I do not recall any music. Maybe they thought laughter and applause would cover it. Instead, there was dead silence, except for the nervous giggles of the dancers. One of them slipped and hit her head on the desk. No one reacted to that either. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Story 23. At college, a guy in my class who was 23 acted like a toddler when the laptop he was using for a presentation froze and ultimately did not save his project. He was also working on the project late and after the deadline. We had months to prepare and he clearly had just started that day. He threw a water bottle across the room, hitting the wall, and yelled like a spoiled brat. I had never cringed so badly in my life. I felt embarrassed for him and his girlfriend, who were in my class. He always acted as if he were intelligent and better than everyone else, but witnessing that was both unsettling and satisfying. He was a total jerk, and in my opinion, he deserved it. Story 24. In 2017, my younger brother and I were on a tour of the Warner Brothers lot where they filmed The Big Bang Theory. As the tour guide talked about the show, My brother shouted Botswana. Back when people made variations of Bazinga as memes. The tour guide asked, "I'm sorry." He repeated it 2 more times, loudly. No one else on the bus understood. The tour guide awkwardly moved on, and the ripples of embarrassment he caused me have echoed through the years. Story 25. My friend and I were at a celebration of life. Her brain short-circuited, and she told the widow, "Congratulations." Story 26. I was attending a back-to-work program. A few of us were sitting around a table while the instructor spoke. A woman working there entered with a cup of tea or coffee for the instructor. Before she reached him, one of my fellow job seekers strangely assumed it was for him. He said cheers to her and reached for the cup. She did not respond and placed it next to the instructor. Story 27. This is a stupid story, but I remember it well. Early one morning, I was on a flight to Chicago that departed around 4 in the morning. It was a short connection, and we landed around 5:30 in the morning. Everyone on the flight was sleeping when it came time to land. A flight attendant walked through the cabin with a trash bag so passengers could discard their trash and the cabin would be clean for the next flight. She gently woke a man sitting across the aisle from me and presented the open bag. He looked confused and reached into the bag of trash. She pulled it away. He withdrew his hand. She offered it again and he reached in again. This happened about 4 times. Finally, she snatched the bag away, leaned over him, and raised her voice. "It's garbage. Do you have any garbage?" He answered, "Oh no." He had thought the trash bag was a goodie bag and that she was offering a post-flight treat. I laughed out loud. It was so awkward and hilarious. Story 28. Watching my cousin during active addiction was awful. Seeing someone you care about make a fool of themselves regularly and not being able to help is heartbreaking. One example is when she got so intoxicated at Thanksgiving that she would not stop talking about her boyfriend's genitals in front of our extended family. At one point, people began to ignore her. I wanted to crawl under the table for her. Story 29. I used to work with a colleague who was a bit immature. Not terrible by itself, but it was clear he resented the job and his leadership team. At every big meeting or event, he would stand up and ask arrogant, teenager-style questions. For example, he might say that if something is required, why is it based on the honor system when we could simply choose not to comply? Felt like watching a teenager argue with parents over curfew. I am in favor of challenging leadership. It is important in many ways, but you have to choose a worthwhile fight. Story 30. My wife, who is usually pretty rational, had a full-on Karen moment at a restaurant because they did not have an outdoor table with an umbrella. I looked at her, said, "You are embarrassing me," and walked back out the front door. Story 31. I was at a college basketball game, and they held one of those half-court shot contests for $10,000 at halftime. For some reason, they picked a woman from the away team's fans to attempt the shot. The fans were fairly rowdy toward each other, so there were boos right away. She did not seem like an obnoxious away fan, but she was clearly nervous and obviously drunk, so I felt kind of bad for her. As she walked to center court, she fell flat on her face and vomited. The booing stopped. We all kind of froze and waited awkwardly as she was helped off and the court was cleaned. They decided to pick another fan to attempt the shot. Again, God knows why they did not cancel it at this point. They chose a very rowdy fan from the home crowd. He completely missed the shot by a wide margin. That left an awkward 5 minutes until the second half started. We all laughed nervously. It was like a double whammy. Story 32. A couple of years ago, in an all-hands meeting at work, one of my coworkers gave an update on a project. By mistake, he read an outdated budget report, and my boss gently corrected him. No big deal, but my coworker, I'm not sure why, then pounded his chest with a limp hand as if trying to imitate a person with an intellectual disability while saying, "Dur. I have never felt such awkwardness and embarrassment." That was the talk at the water cooler for a long time afterward. Story 33. My coworker likes to eat dry packets of instant oats with fruit. We have hot water and a microwave, but she pours them directly into her mouth. She thinks none of us know she does this, so she hides the packets when they are not near her lips. She dumped the oats all over her desk, lap, chest, and the floor. Instead of getting a broom, she began grinding the oats into the floor. We work in food quality control, and that is exactly how you get ants. I felt secondhand embarrassment having to remind her of our good manufacturing practices. Story 34. The Queef. This was around 2008, and I was taking a Saturday morning yoga class. A woman a couple of mats away let out a loud fart. It happens during yoga and is not a big deal, but she could not let it go. She started apologizing to everyone and explaining that it would not smell, so we did not have to worry. Why would it not smell? She explained to the entire class that it was not a fart but air from her vagina. A queef, so it would not smell. She asked if we knew how air can get in there. There was dead silence. She would not stop, only making it more awkward. 18 years later, I still think about it. Story 35. My mom, a white narcissist, started sobbing and apologizing to a black woman after a screening of The Birth of a Nation. The woman was so kind about it, but it was very uncomfortable. Story 36. My mother would get drunk and make a fool of herself in front of people multiple times. I was too young to understand why she was acting foolishly, and I only knew that she was embarrassing me. Story 37. My teacher asked two military personnel to sit and watch a classroom activity where we pretended to be different countries trading goods. They did not say or do anything. It felt humiliating at the time and still feels embarrassing to think about. Story 38. My sweet immigrant dad wanted to make a good impression at his new job as a truck driver. He didn't know much English, but he left some donuts with a note that said, "For you guys." He had meant guys. Story 39. Boyzone appeared on Irish television. They danced in front of a group of elderly audience members because their backing track was not available. Story 40. My first exposure to karaoke occurred when my friends and I stumbled into a strange bar. Not one of our regular stops, just in time to hear the master of ceremonies explain the process. My immediate reaction was that we would be leaving then, but my friends, all men in their 20s and mostly cement-headed, were entranced. None of them could sing even a little, and they thought it was hilarious to drop profanity. My skin was crawling. I had not driven there, so I decided to walk home. It was mid-January, probably well below freezing, and the walk was at least 2 miles along roads that were not pedestrian-friendly. At one point, I fell into a ditch. I barely made it home, but it was worth it. Story 41. Sorry, I can't help with requests that sexualize people in a school setting. I can, however, help rewrite the sentence without sexual content. For example, a friend of mine had to do pull-ups in gym class facing the class. Story 42. In college, I went to see a Holocaust survivor give a presentation. This was in 2014, and he was very old. I sat next to a freshman I did not know. We listened to him talk for 2 hours about the atrocities he witnessed in the camps and the deaths of his family. He had a slideshow of images to drive home the reality of it. At question time, the woman beside me asked, "During your time in the camps, did you ever see compassion in the eyes of your tormentors?" He stood in stunned silence for a moment and replied, "No, absolutely not. I'm an artsy-fartsy humanities major, too, but this was not an award-winning novel. His suffering was awful, not resonant or profound." Story 43. Scott's Tots is the worst secondhand embarrassment I have ever felt, and it comes from a fictional television show. Story 44. My mother is extremely abusive. I was embarrassed when she followed me outside my house and cursed at me, called me names, and threatened to hurt me. Some neighbors were outside listening. I was ashamed to be related to her. Story 45. I teach middle school. A few years ago, a new student tried to gain popularity by arguing with me over a minor instruction. We are a very non-conventional school where the students genuinely love their teachers. I have worked with children since I was 14, and it was difficult to de-escalate the situation. I felt bad for this girl because she misread the situation and kept undermining herself socially. When she arrived, a group of students welcomed her, but she kept having large attention-seeking outbursts. Those outbursts pushed the others away, and she kept doubling down until they no longer wanted to talk to her. Story 46. People who take karaoke way too seriously. You know who you are. Story 47. A flight attendant emerged from the restroom with a 2-foot length of toilet paper trailing from the back of her pants. It waved like a flag as she hurried to the rear of the plane. Story 48. An awkward friend of mine and his girlfriend arrived late to a comedy show and were seated front and center. A comedian made a joke about their appearance. He became upset and started talking back while the audience laughed. He did not stop, and every comedian who came on stage eviscerated him. Story 49. The family was at a stately house in the style of Downton Abbey, taking one of the tours. We entered a room, and the guide remarked that the wallpaper had been designed by someone notable and launched into a spiel. My mum, who is normally quite reserved, for some reason declared how hideous it was. When the guide questioned her, she doubled down loudly and at length, like a precocious child. It was the first time I had ever told one of my parents off in public. I am not saying she had to like it, but for the sake of the guide and the rest of the tour group, please keep it to yourself until we are outside. Story 50. A pet store employee pointed out how patient I was with my mother while she tried to buy fish for an unacceptably small tank. I refused to let her. Story 51. I was at a Christmas party for my gym. I was wearing a romper with a somewhat revealing top because my dresses no longer fit after I gained muscle. A woman came up to me, jabbed my breast, and said I was asking for it because of how I was dressed. She did this in front of her husband, who looked like he wanted to disappear. Story 52. I was at a punk show in the 1980s, and the all-woman band Frightwig invited any man from the audience to come on stage and dance for them. One very intoxicated man accepted. His dance devolved quickly when the lead singer dared him to strip, and he obliged. He ended up completely naked, revealing what could best be described as a micropenis. The collective embarrassment in the venue was palpable, and I still think about it 40 years later. Story 53. On a long flight, my mom's seat happened to be at the front of the section, next to my dad. Having trouble sleeping, she decided it was socially acceptable to leave her seat and lie down on the floor parallel to the seats. It did not take long before a flight attendant asked her to return to her seat. Thankfully, she was not a Karen, but she honestly thought that being able to unbuckle her seatbelt meant everything was safe. Story 54. When someone loudly argues a point in public and then realizes mid-sentence that they misunderstood the situation entirely. Story 55. My friend tried stand-up comedy. There were no laughs, but he kept going for 15 minutes. Story 56. I had a coworker 20 years ago who was very sweet and naive. I became convinced she must have had teenage sons teasing her. Here are some of the ideas and sayings she brought up over the years. She would say, "Let's go balls deep on this project." She suggested naming the training program Client Leadership in Training. She suggested giving clients 2 blue stress balls, 1 for each hand. Another team-building merchandise idea was to order 2 handprints on the back of the shirts, which everyone wore backwards. She suggested adding a bit of baby powder to a client mailing. This was shortly after the anthrax scare following September 11th. It caused constant secondhand embarrassment, and it was awkward to explain things to a very sweet, middle-aged woman. There are more examples. These are the ones I remember at the moment. Story 57. A friend accidentally sent a flirty text intended for his girlfriend to our group chat, and it remained there for several hours before he realized his mistake. Story 58. I went to Cuba with my friend when we were 18 for the first time away from home, and she lost her temper at the front desk clerk, who barely spoke English, about the wireless internet not working and how she needed it. She was absolutely screaming at her, and I walked away because I could not be near her. The poor woman at the desk was so shocked and looked kind of scared. After my friend left, I apologized on her behalf and gave the clerk a tip. I cannot handle being with people who are rude to service workers. It is disgusting and embarrassing behavior. Story 59. It happened on live television. Back in 2001, the Diamondbacks were making their Major League Baseball playoff run. The Diamondbacks had just won the series, and the television crew was doing live interviews with the players on the field. They interviewed Tony Womack, and at some point his wife walked over and stood next to him. The reporter asked, "So, is this your mom?" Tony replied, "No, it's my wife. Kind of hard to dig your way out of that one. Story 60. Anytime I'm watching a favorite television show, whether a cartoon or live action, and my favorite character does something cringeworthy, it's 10 times more embarrassing if I'm watching with someone else and they look at me and say, "That's the character you like?" Story 61. One of my aunts has some issues. Once when I was visiting her, she stopped at CVS Pharmacy to buy candles. After waiting in the car for a long time, I got out to see what the problem was. I walked in and found her yelling at the cashier, with a long line of people waiting. She was yelling at him for overcharging her. He kept trying to interrupt, but she barely paused to take a breath. She was complaining about being overcharged by about 50 cents because he had not scanned her coupon. I intervened and said, "Karen, if you would let this young man speak for a second, I think he is trying to tell you that your coupon is expired." Story 62. On my 30th birthday, my father, who was 68 at the time and is now 77, took my wife, my sister, and me out for dinner. He was not a foodie like my wife and me, so I opted to take us to Longhorn Steakhouse. Dinner went perfectly fine until the bill came. If memory serves, it was around $150. My dad paid for the dinner in cash, and when it came time for the tip, he pulled out two $1 bills, looked at my sister, and asked if that was enough for a tip. My sister, extraordinarily cheap, told him that was plenty. My wife and I were mortified. As they got up to leave, my wife and I feigned having lost something in the booth. Once my dad and sister were out of sight, we each pulled out $20 and left it for the waitress. I love my dad to death, and my wife and I still joke about this nearly 10 years later. Story 63. A colleague was laid off as part of a mass layoff, so many people were let go at the same time. He sent a mass goodbye email, as many do, announcing his departure and wishing everyone well. Then he continued writing and began ranting that the only people who kept their jobs were those who performed explicit sexual acts, describing them in detail. He lambasted the company, criticized management, and disparaged anyone still employed. Then he hit send. There were about 60 people on the to list, roughly half of whom were still employed by the company. In an industry where you often work with the same people repeatedly, that bridge was not just burned. It was destroyed. Story 64. My dad had dementia toward the end. Once he visited us with my mother and siblings for a meal. We called a taxi to take them home. He saw a car pull up and, before we could react, got up, climbed in, and told them to drive to a house where he used to live. The car belonged to a drug dealer who had pulled up to sell drugs to some students who lived down the road. Story 65. I worked at Limited Brands, which owns Victoria's Secret. They had an employee program called the Wear Test where you could try bras, underwear, and give feedback. The chief executive officer of Victoria's Secret was a woman at the time. She had apparently lost weight because her assistant emailed the Wear Test team to request a smaller size for her in the future, but the assistant sent the message to everyone, including employees at Victoria's Secret and Bath and Body Works. Thousands of people received the chief executive officer's bra size. Story 66. A friend of mine was going through a rough divorce. She went out with my husband and me one night to a bar a few blocks from our house. So we walked. She became very drunk. She hit on the entertainer, one of her co-workers at her day job who was much younger than she was. On the way home, my husband and I had to carry her. She ended up urinating on herself. When we got to my place, I gave her sweatpants to wear and put her to bed. When she woke up the next day, she did not even seem hungover. She was a bit embarrassed about it, but was laughing about it with friends the following weekend while drinking heavily again. I probably would not have told a soul about that night and would have given up alcohol for a year myself. Story 67. I watched a woman at a work party receive a small gift from a colleague. It was a set of wine glass ring markers that you put around the stem so you know which glass is yours. The woman did not know this and reacted, "Oh my God. I love them and I love how you can mix and match them." Then she took her earrings out and put one marker in each ear. She thought they were earrings. The woman who gave them to her was too shy to correct her. So she walked around the entire Christmas party wearing two different wine glass ring markers in her ears and bragged to everyone about her new wine-themed earrings. Later that week, she posted an Instagram story about a wine girls' night. The wine glasses had the ring markers on them, and she was also wearing them as earrings. A week later, she still thought they were earrings. Story 68. This is half my own embarrassment and half secondhand. I was a receptionist at a nursing home and received a very serious phone call from a resident saying, "There is a gas leak in my room." Naturally, I panicked like a responsible adult and alerted the director of the building. He told me to radio maintenance and said he would meet them there. So, over the walkie-talkie, which every employee could hear, I announced, "Maintenance. A resident reports a gas leak in room number." Maintenance went to the room. A minute later, they came back on the radio and said, "Confirmed. Resident was smelling their roommate." Then the director hopped on and said, "I guess we should have clarified what kind of gas." I wanted to die immediately. The director and staff never let me live it down. Story 69. I was at a spa waiting to speak to the receptionist. A client who was already being served had a prominently bulging stomach but was not overweight. The receptionist was preparing her for her treatment and asked her to fill in a form. She said gently, "I can see that you are pregnant, so please fill this out." The client shouted at the top of her voice, "I am not pregnant. This is a tumor. I have cancer and I am going to die." She burst into tears and stormed off. The receptionist stared into the middle distance for a long time before silently going to the back. There were no winners in that exchange. Story 70. My sister-in-law records TikTok videos for her shop. That is not embarrassing in itself, but the videos use her voice and it is not even her speaking voice. The sound makes me uncomfortable and I cannot watch them anymore. She is lovely but not a natural on camera. Story 71. I was at a comedy quiz night at university with some of the people I lived with. One member of our team was socially awkward. We were sitting in the front row, so we stood out. When the comedian asked him for the team name, he gave our house number and street name. Story 72. It is frustrating to watch someone confidently state a fact that is objectively wrong, yet they are so loud about it that no one wants to correct them. Story 73. As an American, I could not be more embarrassed by the current president and his entire administration. Story 74. I got in trouble at school, and my mother launched a homophobic tirade against the administrator who had helped and supported the teacher. It was a full Karen moment. I am a homosexual. Story 75. When people throw tantrums at customer service agents at a hotel, airport, or store, I can understand being annoyed and short. I mean when they get loud, rude, and hostile so everyone around can hear. Very few situations require melting down to get help. You will probably get better service if you are respectful, kind, and easy to work with. These employees deal with unhappy customers daily and appreciate those who stay calm and collected. Their situation is not the end of the world. You do not need to escalate because you missed your flight or your departure was delayed by weather. It is annoying, but it is not grounds for a toddler-style tantrum in the middle of an airport. Story 76. In 2008, during Season 7 of American Idol, contestant Brooke White was performing live, forgot the words, and stopped singing. Hundreds in the audience and millions of viewers at home witnessed the incredibly uncomfortable moment. Story 77. In Year 5, a girl's sanitary pad fell out of her shorts during physical education class. Story 78. My dad did not finish middle school and believes he knows other people's jobs better than they do. I have seen him argue with doctors and show zero boundaries. This weekend, he took his car to the mechanic. He said he changed the tires himself and helped with the repairs. I doubt the mechanic wanted him there. He tends to take over. If he hires you, he will hover over your shoulder, brag, and make offensive jokes to see how far he can push it. He is likely a narcissist. Story 79. A new woman at an old job of mine threw a party at her house and invited only a handful of our coworkers. She had been working there for about a week and a half. In short, none of them went. She had spent over $100 on food and drinks, but everyone canceled at the last second. That's all the information I have. I was not invited, laughing out loud. She quit suddenly not long after, and she seemed very hurt during her brief time there. Story 80. My mother told my black roommate that she is a credit to her race. I wanted to die. Story 81. I was in Kyoto, Japan, which, unlike other major Japanese cities, does not have a very intuitive public transit system. In my limited experience, Kyoto relies more on buses than trains. The bus stops are labeled in kanji, and the transit apps do not function well for a non-Japanese speaker in this specific context. I was riding the bus across town to see the Golden Kinkakuji Temple. On the bus were about 5 elderly locals and 30 tourists. One of the tourists, a Frenchman, walked up to the driver and started speaking in French. The driver obviously did not know French and was driving the bus. The tourist quickly became frustrated. Within 30 seconds it escalated from asking a question in an unfamiliar language to full-on yelling, spit flying at the driver, who was still driving. This went on for what felt like years but was probably 3 minutes, until the driver pulled over and started yelling back in Japanese. They could not understand each other, and everyone else fell silent. Finally, one of the elderly locals stood up and politely told the angry tourist in English that the bus driver wanted him to get off. In perfect English, the angry tourist yelled at the elderly woman, "I do not speak English, cunt." The driver was stunned. The tourist's wife grabbed his arm to get off the bus. When the angry tourist and his wife moved to exit through the middle doorway, every other tourist got off with them. Turned out they were a large group, and I had been completely oblivious. So it was just me, a driver near tears, and 5 elderly Japanese people. I was red with embarrassment. No one said a word, which is typical for Japanese transit but felt like pulling teeth after that scene. I got off the bus 2 stops later at the temple. As I left, I said "Gomen nasai" and bowed to the driver and the woman. I do not know enough Japanese to convey fully what I felt, but I like to think they understood. Bonus. I walked the temple grounds and, as I was leaving to catch the bus home, I saw the large group walking up the street toward the temple after having walked at least 1 or 2 miles. The temple had just closed to the public as I was leaving, so they did not get to see it that day. I took an Uber back to my hotel to avoid the possibility of riding a bus with them back to the city center. Story 82. I wasn't there, but my girlfriend told me that her roommate was at her boyfriend's house. They were having a party, and the roommate got very drunk. She woke up, went downstairs, squatted on the area rug in front of the partygoers, and defecated on it. Story 83. I am in my 50s. As a child, I remember hearing Jimmy Carter speak as President of the United States. I was too young to remember President Ford. I have heard presidents from both the Democratic and Republican parties. I cannot listen to that president speak for more than a few minutes. As an American, I am embarrassed that he cannot express coherent thoughts. Story 84. My ex-boyfriend and I were at an ice cream and pizza restaurant, looking at the ice cream. He was a metalhead with long hair and big muscles from working in landscaping. I used to dye my hair many rainbow colors. At the time it was blue. An older man behind us was ranting about the damn liberals and used a racial slur and a homophobic slur. He tapped my shoulder and said something like, "What are you two young people fighting about?" When my boyfriend turned around, the man jumped back and immediately apologized, because he had assumed we were lesbians and was about to confront us. The person serving us was the manager, who loudly scolded the man for behaving rudely in a family restaurant and told him to leave without a refund. I was surprised he looked ashamed and embarrassed as he left. That served him right. Story 85. The worst Freudian slip I ever saw happen during mandatory sexual harassment training. We were each asked to read a line from a text. When it was her turn, probably because the training had primed her to avoid sexual topics and she was thinking about them, she misread the words and said something like "suck cock wetness ass" in front of the whole room, including the human resources trainer. She was completely mortified. She was not known to have Tourette's, but it sounded like it. Story 86. At the store, I witnessed a woman go on a racist tirade toward a woman she believed was Asian, telling her to go back to where she came from, but the woman was actually Native American. Story 87. This happened in my first job. The manager sent an email to the whole team praising his subordinate's work. She replied to all, saying "Thank you, darling," and that was when everyone knew they were having an affair. Story 88. At a high school assembly, there was an aisle down the middle of the seating. The principal announced something special was in store and left the podium. Then a large, well-fed man came down the aisle from the back door, barking loudly while on all fours and on a leash held by another man. I could not stop laughing from secondhand embarrassment until he reached the front of the stage and stood up. It was my uncle. He was doing a skit for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals for a good cause, but I almost died that day. Story 89. When one person keeps talking to another who clearly wants to leave the conversation as soon as possible, read the other person's body language and take the hint. Oh my God. Story 90. My brother does not have a job, and his wife is pregnant with their 11th child. They are very devout Catholics and homeschool their children. Several family members have clear, undiagnosed illnesses, and the oldest children raise the youngest. It is embarrassing and infuriating. Story 91. A friend's wife always finds something wrong when we go out to eat and gets items comped on her bill. For example, she complains that her drink was not refilled enough and says she should not have to pay for it. I have stopped going out when she will be there. It is the worst. Story 92. I went to dinner with friends I had not seen since college. One of them ordered fish tacos but asked to have all of the ingredients served in separate bowls because she did not like some components. At first, it was only slightly embarrassing, since people have food preferences. The same woman then ate all of the tacos and afterward used a leftover piece of fried fish to berate the server about how overcooked it was, in order to have the meal taken off the bill. She got her way and also demanded a free dessert. It was humiliating for the whole table. I asked her repeatedly to stop while she was doing it, then went to the manager and the server afterward to tell them they had done nothing wrong, and I tipped double my planned amount to try to compensate. Story 93. I attended the funeral of the son of one of my employees. During the service, the employee's wife performed an interpretive dance to a song that she and her son had both enjoyed. Story 94. 20 years ago, I watched a young couple go for a stroll in the neighborhood, both around 24. They had probably just started dating. You could tell the woman was proud and was showing off, saying, "Look at me, I have a boyfriend," dressed up for their age, completely in white with heavy makeup. That is fine, we have all been there. It was not a good time in her cycle to wear white trousers. They were very see-through, and her sanitary pad was visible. I do not know why, but that image is burned into my memory. Story 95. A friend of mine loses his temper if someone challenges him on something he believes he is right about. Even if he is right, his reactions go from 0 to 100 at light speed. He has multiple lawsuits because he cannot back away even on minor matters. He must be right at the expense of his own peace and happiness. His need is all-consuming. He has been banned from stores and restaurants and cannot keep a job. It is extremely tiring and very embarrassing to be around when it happens. Story 96. I played ice hockey as a kid, around 9 or 10 years old. In my first season, my mother was thrown out of the stands by the referees and rink managers multiple times, and my stepfather eventually banned her from bringing me. The worst incident was my first game at our home rink. I do not know what set her off, but she was banging on the glass and yelling at the referees. She opened the rink door and kept shouting. She eventually sat down, but about 15 minutes later she started arguing with some parents from the other team, shouting across the bleachers at them. Rink management intervened and ejected her to prevent a fight. On the bench, my teammates were asking whose mother it was, so I quickly joined the conversation so they would find out she was my mom. I wanted to die. The second time was at an away game. She was ejected during the first period for throwing a bag of popcorn onto the ice, so it was not as big a deal because she did not have a chance to escalate. Story 97. One Halloween, my parents' East Asian neighbors brought their 3-year-old son by for trick-or-treating. They had dressed him as an old kung fu master, bald head, flowing robes, wispy mustache, and so on. My dad, oblivious to current social mores, leaned down and said, "Chi chi chow wa," with utter delight. I stood in the background, wishing I could melt into the hedge, Homer Simpson style. This sadly only just edges out the time he referred to some clients of his as those homo guys during a call with a colleague. You can bet the caller heard my sister and me shriek in the background, "Dad, you can't say that." I laughed. It's a work in progress. Story 98. My mother-in-law and father-in-law got in a taxi with me after leaving the pub in the United Kingdom. The taxi driver was black, and they were chit-chatting and being friendly, but they asked, "So where are you from?" Then they followed with, "Originally," when told the next town over. They went on to say, "In Spain on the beach, you know, the looky-looky men," and laughed. The driver was polite and laughed along, and they showed no obvious malice. But I sank into the seat and wished the 4-minute drive would end much sooner. Story 99. My husband and I were at a party when a married couple who were our friends brought their 3-year-old son. A man we were playing games with, someone most people tolerate but do not like, told the child to call his father a racist. It was so embarrassing that my cheeks went red. Story 100. There were many incidents, but one that comes to mind involved my former professor, for whom I worked as a teaching assistant. He was arrogant and ignorant but quite attractive, and he knew it. One summer we had a celebration at a restaurant and sat outside. He kneeled down to speak to one of his doctoral students, and 2 young attractive women wanted to get through. They told him he was in good shape but needed to move to let them through, saying it in a very flirty way. They were students I had seen at university. He was in a relationship at the time, but he flirted back in front of the whole group. He behaved like that on several occasions, sometimes toward me as well. That situation was especially awkward. Story 101. I worked at a Korean barbecue restaurant in college. The owners were a married couple who also owned a sushi restaurant, so the workers from both places all knew each other and hung out. I was working a shift when one of the waitresses from the sushi restaurant came in and had a few post-shift drinks with some of our coworkers. She told a story about how a dumb white girl complained that a sushi roll was too fishy. We all laughed. Then I looked at my phone and saw that my girlfriend had texted me earlier saying she was leaving the sushi place. I texted her back, "How was it?" She replied, "Not as good as usual. There was a problem with one of the rolls." My stomach sank. My girlfriend was the dumb white girl. She hung around a lot, and I drunkenly introduced her to that waitress one night. She was embarrassed, but it became a water under the bridge moment. She is now my wife and the mother of our 2 kids. She hasn't complained about a sushi roll since. Story 102. I went on a date with a man who pretended to know people at an upscale bar. He would wave to a group of men and they would look confused. This happened 2 or 3 times, and I pretended not to notice to spare his embarrassment. At one point he went to the restroom, and when he returned he said he had bumped into some men who wanted to send us shots. A server brought the drinks and then asked him for the name on the tab. He argued that another man had said he sent them over. Multiple people at the bar then came over and said no one had offered to buy them and that he had ordered them himself. I wanted to run away and hide. It was so embarrassing. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.